that you will find on the table as indicated. Please consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. The room layout has been adjusted to increase the distance between microphones and reduce the chance of feedback from an ambient earpiece. So the witnesses are all spread out as well as members. I am going to speak at the liaison committee about adding some room for witnesses as well as members going forward. But for now, we're going to have to work through this process because these measures are in place so we can conduct our business without harming the interpreters, and to ensure they're safe and healthy is safeguarded at all times. Merci à tous pour votre coopération.
I thank you all for your cooperation. And I remind you once again that all interventions from members and witnesses are through the chair.
I'd like to welcome our witnesses from the Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan, Auditor General of Canada, Joanne Swartz, Principal, Milanese Joannis, Director. Nice to see you all here today. From the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Sean Tupper, Deputy Minister. Nice to see you. Chris Moore, nice to see you as well. Assistant Deputy Minister, Indigenous Affairs Branch. And from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Brian Larkin. Nice to see you. Deputy Commissioner, Specialized Policing Services, and Warren Brown, Assistant Commissioner, Indigenous and Support Services. Each organization will be given a maximum of 5 minutes for your remarks. After that, we'll proceed to our rounds of questionings. There will be votes, possibly bells early. I will look for consent if we want to proceed in our allotted time, but I'll do that when the bells begin. So without further ado, Ms. Hogan, you have the floor for up to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our report on the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program, which was tabled in Parliament on the 19th of March 2024. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. This area is also known as Ottawa. I express my gratitude and respect to all Indigenous peoples who have contributed to shaping and safeguarding the beautiful lands they call home throughout Canada. Joining me today are Joanne Swartz, the principal who was responsible for the audit, and Mélanie Joannis, the director who led the audit team. The First Nations and Inuit Policing Program was created in 1991. We last audited this program in 2014, 10 years ago, and again, this time we found critical shortcomings in how it is being managed. Public Safety Canada is the lead in managing and overseeing the program. We found that the department did not work in partnership with Indigenous communities to provide equitable access to policing services that were tailored to their needs. Through the program's community tripartite agreements, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP, delivers dedicated policing services that supplement the ones from the province or territory. We found that the RCMP did not work in partnership with Indigenous communities to provide proactive policing services.
Significantly increased over the last 10 years, we found that $13 million of funds earmarked for the 2022-23 fiscal year went unspent. As of October 2023, Public Safety Canada anticipated that over $45 million of program funds would be left undispersed at the end of the 2023-24 fiscal year. This is concerning in the context of a program intended to support the safety of Indigenous communities. Public Safety Canada did not have an approach to allocate funds equitably to communities. The department told us that it relied on the provinces or territories' readiness to fund their share of the program and on past funding received by communities to determine the amounts allocated. Over the past 5 years, the RCMP has been unable to fully staff the positions funded under the community tripartite agreements. This leaves First Nations and Inuit communities without the level of proactive and community-focused policing services that they should receive. Lastly, neither Public Safety Canada nor the RCMP could identify whether requirements set out in policing agreements were being met and whether the program was achieving its intended results. It is important to monitor and analyze data to not only meet the community's security and safety needs, but also to support the self-determination of communities. Given that this program has not been updated since 1996 and long-standing issues persist, Public Safety Canada must work with First Nations and Inuit communities, provinces and territories, as well as the RCMP, to find a way to more effectively provide proactive and culturally appropriate policing services. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We'll be pleased to answer any questions the committee members may have. Thank you.
Auditor. Turning now to Mr. Tupper from the Department of Public Safety Emergency Preparedness. I'm having a tough time today. Over to you for 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, committee members, thank you for inviting me and my Assistant Deputy Minister, Chris Morin, to appear before you today here in the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Je suis heureux d'avoir la possibilité de parler.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak about the Auditor General of Canada's Performance Audit Report on the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program. Since 1991, the program has provided cost-matched funding to support access to dedicated, culturally responsive policing services in First Nations and Inuit communities. This program supports 36 self-administered police services which provide community policing in more than 155 First Nation and Inuit communities.
Tight stream, the program also provides funding to support an enhanced level of policing in communities that are served by the RCMP. This cost-matching approach supports investments in an area of provincial territorial jurisdiction, and Public Safety Canada is committed to improving the program in collaboration with provinces and territories of jurisdiction with First Nations and Inuit communities. In response to the Auditor General's Performance Audit Report, Public Safety has developed a preliminary action plan to address the report's recommendations. We are calling it preliminary because of the importance of engaging with First Nation and Inuit partners and the provinces and territories to do this work. That said, the Department has already started taking action to address the Auditor General's recommendations. The Department has recently aligned the delivery of programs, Indigenous policing and community safety policy, and engagement and considerations into a single branch to create more efficient, coherent program delivery and to improve the integration of policy on Indigenous issues within the public safety mandate. Bien qu'il y ait beaucoup à faire, le fait d'avoir
While there is much to do, having a clear line of accountability will help to ensure that it gets done. This branch is working with provinces and territories and First Nation and Inuit communities to identify improvements to program governance with a view to delivering its cost-matching funding faster.
Indigenous-led regional and national engagement sessions have been held over the winter on proposed legislative options to advance the minister's mandate to co-develop federal legislation to recognize First Nation police services as essential services. The government also reiterated its commitment to this initiative in Budget 2024. The engagement sessions build on ongoing collaboration Public Safety Canada has fostered with First Nations and subject matter experts like the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association and First Nations Police Governance Council, as well as provincial and territorial representatives. Public Safety is also revisiting the program management relationship with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to more readily consider and integrate officer availability in program management decisions. And the RCMP are continuing to work with communities to improve cultural awareness practices as they reaffirm their commitment to keeping Indigenous communities safe, including through the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program. Dans toutes ces initiatives,
Through all of these initiatives, collaboration is key. Public Safety will continue to work closely with First Nations and Inuit partners, law enforcement agencies, and provinces and territories.
making decisions on the level of policing needs in their jurisdiction, and consistent with this, they drive decisions on investment priorities for this program by providing 48% of the costs, which the federal government then meets with the remaining 52% within its funding allocation. This approach presents challenges, and public safety is aware of the opportunity and is undertaking the necessary work to improve program governance and, in turn, delivery and outcome. The audit report will inform this shared work, help strengthen our ability to overcome challenges, and ensure the continued success of the FNIPP program. I know that commitment to reconciliation is top of mind in every step we take on this shared path with our Indigenous partner. Ce travail a une incidence directe sur
This work directly affects the safety and security of the Indigenous communities who rely on these services.
Report recommended improvements in fostering collaboration. We aim to create a safer environment, build stronger relationships with Indigenous communities, and ensure that their unique needs are met. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And finally, from the RCMP, Mr. Larkin, you have the floor for about 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Sur notre
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of Mr. Duhem, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today on the 2024 report to the Auditor General on the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program.
By Assistant Commissioner Warren Brown, who oversees our Indigenous policing and our community engagement program as a part of our contract in Indigenous policing here at National Headquarters in Ottawa. All Canadians have the right to receive culturally responsive and respectful police services. Indigenous communities and reconciliation are one of the RCMP's key strategic priorities, the primary goal of which is to contribute to a healthy, safety, and ensuring a prosperous Indigenous community. Under the FNIPP, the RCMP works with external partners, including Public Safety Canada, to coordinate efforts to contribute to the safety of these communities by providing professional, dedicated, and responsive services to First Nation and Inuit peoples. The RCMP is committed to addressing systemic racism and discrimination while remaining dedicated to strengthening trust with our First Nations communities, our Inuit communities, and the Métis peoples, as well as communities and employees. The RCMP is focused on making decisions, on developing policies, developing programs and practices, as well as training that are informed by evidence, that are responsive to community needs, and are culturally appropriate. Changes have been informed and guided through increased engagement with Indigenous leaders, consultative groups, elders, and youth, as well as in collaboration with government department partners such as the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, Women and Gender Equality Canada, the Department of Justice, as well as Public Safety Canada. The FNIPP, for example, enhances community policing services, supports culturally responsive policing within the First Nation and Inuit communities that we serve, and recognizes input from Indigenous communities on the policing services received. The RCMP are service providers under the FNIPP through the community tripart agreements contracted to provide policing services to a First Nation or Inuit community. In March of this year, the RCMP welcomed the Office of the Auditor General's report on the FNIPP. We believe that by implementing the Auditor General's recommendations, the RCMP can help improve the delivery of police services under this program. We want to be clear that the RCMP agrees and supports the recommendations of the OAG report and will commit to working with all stakeholders, all partners to address the issues raised, as well as contribute to a significantly strong action plan. The action plan will respect the jurisdiction of provinces and territories over operational policing, reconfirming the role of the federal government as a financial contributor, and respond to audit recommendations to improve the strategic focus and the measurable impact of the program. Beyond the program, though, the RCMP continues to work with communities to make cultural awareness part of the process for all new RCMP regular members who are joining this program and joining our organization. We are also prioritizing their participation and inclusion in localized cultural events. Building strong relations with Indigenous communities is extremely important to the RCMP. In the spirit of reconciliation, we look to continue to establish enhanced trust within the communities that we serve. In addition to the FNIPP, the RCMP has implemented the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis recruitment strategy which was launched in 2023. We've advanced efforts for sharing of information related to various Indigenous communities with regular members. We are supporting regular members in reporting on their participation in various activities in communities and reconciliation efforts for information and awareness sharing. We continue to work with all communities to make cultural awareness a part of the community onboarding process for our police officers. The RCMP will continue to work with communities to upload their safety and to build and strengthen relationships that are based on mutual respect, trust, and have the interests of the communities at the heart. I once again want to reaffirm that we accept the OAG recommendations, and we look forward to working with all of our partners to advance and to strengthen the communities that we serve. Again, thank you on behalf of Commissioner Dehem for inviting us to appear before you today. We look forward to the questions. Merci beaucoup à tous.
Thank you all very much. Beginning our first round of questions, the first four members will each have 6 minutes each. Mr. Malillo, you are beginning for us. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to join your committee today as a guest, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here at the Auditor General. Good to see you again. I know you were at Indigenous Affairs yesterday, so we're keeping you busy this week. We appreciate all of your time and efforts on this important issue, and I'll start with you, Auditor General. I thank you for answering the questions yesterday and being present. In the report, you also found that public safety was not monitoring the policing program's effectiveness and not analyzing the information that's being provided by First Nation and Inuit police services. I believe a similar finding was found for the RCMP. I'm wondering if you can speak to that on how that's played out and how that has been impacting the service that's being provided.
So I'll take a first crack at it, and I'll see if Joanne or Melanie might want to add something. What we were looking for was to see whether they knew whether they were first meeting the requirements of the agreements. And what we found is that in most cases, the RCMP was unable to tell us whether a police officer had spent 100% of their time dedicated to the community as they were supposed to. In the detachments that we looked at, there was only 38% of them who could tell us that they were really dedicating their time to a culturally appropriate approach to policing services. When it came to public safety, I would outline a few things. The first would be that they weren't monitoring how the RCMP was spending those funds, but then weren't really gathering the data on the effectiveness, right? They were gathering response rates and so on, which is really the traditional way to look at policing. How many calls did you answer or so on, versus were you actually in the community building trust and different relationships. So I'll see if you want to add anything to that, either of you, or did I do okay? Okay.
Thank you for that. I think one other element that we could mention is for both the entities, we found a lack of monitoring related to gender diverse or women in terms of if they were looking to see if the information that they were collecting would show them any trends or changes that they need to make with regard to the services that they were providing.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I won't repeat what we talked about yesterday, but just I want to build off of it because you highlighted, of course, a number of issues, Auditor General. And I think the overarching thing we come back to is moving towards self-administered agreements and moving towards a place where First Nation and Inuit policing services are recognized as essential is where we want to be and where we need to be. Public safety mentioned that that's something that they've been working on, and I'll come to you in a minute here. But the former Minister for Public Safety mentioned, I believe it was September 2022, that the legislation will be just around the corner. Now, of course, that's a pretty wide corner because we're a couple of years out and we still don't have that legislation brought forward. So can you speak to that gap that exists where and how that could be fixed by declaring these, recognizing these services as essential and moving towards self-administered agreements?
So I'm not going to comment on the speed at which bills or legislation moves through Parliament. I'll leave that to all parliamentarians to adjust as they see fit. When it comes to, however, deciding that services should be essential, I think it comes with recognizing that you need to understand the full demand for those services. And right now, one of the findings in our audit report was that public safety doesn't know that full demand, whether it be that there isn't an application process to know how many other communities might want it or what the full need is. Right now, it's about using the funds available to beef up services under existing agreements. We didn't see much expansion. We saw a small expansion into the north, but not much expansion, and no community moving between a tripartite agreement into a self-administered. While one did move right after the end of our audit period, that's very little progress for the additional funding that was put to the program with the purpose of expanding it. So I think to define it as essential needs to come with knowing what that means. What will that mean for the federal government to fund this appropriately?
Absolutely. Just very quickly with my remaining time, I'll go to public safety now because, of course, as we just spoke about, it's been many years, and this legislation recognizing the essential nature of this work isn't there, and I think that's a concern for a number of people, especially in my region. I'm in Treaty 3 area now where that police service is operating without any agreement whatsoever. There's also the case that $45 million of program funds was estimated to be left on the table just because of the clause of these tripartite agreements. And of course, that's not an acceptable excuse for people that are needing these essential services. So if I can ask public safety, what is being done to rectify that, to ensure that the dollars allocated are able to be spent, and what's being done to expedite the process of moving that essential legislation?
With respect to the legislation, it is taking longer than we might have anticipated, but I think doing it in a co-developed way, making sure that we have a process that is acceptable to our Indigenous partners, agreeing on the mandate in terms of how we would develop that legislation has not been an easy task. I think we find ourselves in a position now with the provinces and territories where there's general understanding of the intent of the essential legislation, essential services legislation, but we have varied voices within the Indigenous community. We have been engaged with the AFN since the beginning of our efforts, and we have been traveling the country to engage with communities and leadership within the policing community. It is just simply the struggle of co-developing legislation in a way that we are not typically asked to develop legislation, and so it's taking longer. With respect to money left on the table, we are a program that flows funds against expenses in the program. We do find ourselves at the end of fiscal years in situations where not all the money that has been identified for spending has been spent, and therefore the money doesn't flow. That's to ensure that it is not going out the door and becoming used in other ways in other programs. And so we are stuck in a situation where a province may choose not to match the fund, and therefore we can't flow the funds. It may be, as we have seen in recent years, simply a labor market choice where the RCMP are unable to fully staff their vacant positions as a result of labor market challenges, and consequently the money doesn't get spent.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Mr. Chen, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Auditor General, to the witnesses that are here before this committee today. I understand that through this program, the provinces, not all of them have a provincial police force. So my question is, what sort of challenges presents itself when we are trying to ensure that there is a community tripartite agreement under this specific program in provinces where there is no provincial police force?
You want me to do that? Okay. So the CTAs, the tripartite arrangements, are the result of the fact that we have RCMP in all of the provinces and territories, save for Ontario and Quebec. So in Ontario and Quebec, because we can make different arrangements directly with the communities under their legislation, you see the predominance of the self-administered agreements there. And it's just simply a design of how the law works in those jurisdictions, and the advantage that we have at times of having the RCMP in place in other jurisdictions. Technically, all provinces have provincial police services, and that is available to them through the contract that we enter into with the provinces and territories that don't have their own provincial police service. So indeed, there is police on the ground that would be considered provincial police, and that is done through the contract that we have.
Fantastic. So I understand that the number of RCMP officer positions under this community tripartite agreement has increased in terms of positions available, but the number of positions filled has been rather consistent over the past few years. So can you share with this committee what are some of the challenges besides the remoteness of the location of these positions in recruiting and attracting talented people to fill these jobs?
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. And as Deputy Tupper alluded to, one of the challenges in the last couple of years has been the labor market, although we're seeing significant change. And so we do anticipate a much more positive outlook as we look at 2024 and beyond. It's no secret that across the country, the RCMP has been dealing with recruitment and vacancy issues in all areas of provincial policing, municipal policing, federal policing, and specialized policing. We currently sit at a national rate of about 15% vacancy. However, I can tell you that this has been one of Commissioner Dehem's national priorities, and hence to assist with this, we've actually recently created a senior leadership role that is solely focused on national recruiting, around onboarding, as well as making our process much more seamless, much more proactive base, attracting coast to coast to coast, as well as a significant lens around reflecting the communities we serve. And we're seeing significant actual change in our recruiting numbers. And Depot, although we are attritioning more than we are actually recruiting right now, and that's largely based on we did lose. Depot was closed for a period of time throughout the pandemic, and so we are playing catch-up. But I'm pleased to announce that this year we anticipate 40 full troops of 32 regular members, and we anticipate in the next fiscal year to increase that to 50 troops. And of course, we're exploring other different ways of bringing direct entry members into our organization, experienced police officers. We're also, and I'll turn to Assistant Commissioner Brown, from an Indigenous perspective, though, one of the challenges that we're dealing with is obviously we do have some remote areas, but we're looking at different opportunities, different servicing models to support those communities. But we're also proud to announce that this is the 30th year of our Indigenous pre-cadet process, where we actually welcome Indigenous young persons into our organization to get an understanding of what Depot looks like, what training looks like. And we've also added this year the first ever in a long time Indigenous troop, so 32 Indigenous members of the RCMP participating in a complete troop. We hope to continue to advance that. And we've actually launched a recruiting strategy that is focused around Indigenous. But Assistant Commissioner Brown, I'll turn to you for some other challenges around other than just remoteness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for a little perspective, the RCMP, we police in 146 community tripartite agreements. That's 443 regular members. We have 30 positions vacant right now. That's our latest statistics. That's approximately 11% vacancy pattern compared to Deputy Commissioner 15% reference to our contract policing overall. So I'm not saying that's fantastic, but that's positive in that we're not going the other way. We also police 22% of Canada's population, which is 75% of our land mass. There's 647 detachments. 556 of those detachments police in Indigenous communities. That's 489 First Nations, that's 36 Inuit communities, and 31 Métis settlements. No two Indigenous communities are the same. Some are more remote. There's different cultures, different practices. There's different levels of engagement. So I would say this is a really, really good opportunity. Thank you to the Auditor General's report to give us a foundation of what gaps we have and how to move forward more positively with Public Safety Canada.
Thank you. I note that the Auditor General identified 61 funded positions that remain vacant. So it does sound like things are going in the right direction. My final question to the Auditor General is that the First Nations and Inuit Police Program was created in 1991, last updated in 1996 through your work in auditing other comparable programs in the federal government. Is this common that we have a program that is based off a policy from 1996?
I'll have to tell you, I think it depends. The right answer is really it depends. Why we highlight it here as really something that needs to be looked at is when we audited this program the first time in 2014, that was one of the concerns raised then, is that there were constraints because of the 1991 policy that had been updated in 1996 and that it was still constraining. So we made a recommendation in 2014 to fix your policy. That's something that you can easily do, and we find that that is still a position given to us from public safety, and so it really is time, if it's restrictive, to fix it.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Monsieur Lemire.
Now we'll have Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the members for your welcome. In Quebec, all of the agreements with First Nations and Inuit are self-administered agreements, and either the First Nation or Inuit group manage their own police service according to provincial regulations. And Ms. Hogan, I thank you for your report. You said that the department is not able to identify the extra resources they put towards these agreements. So how is that possible in 2024? Well, I'm going to ask Melanie if she might want to add to this, but this is an issue that concerns me when there are additional funds that have been allocated for a given reason, and then the department is not in a position to tell us that it's being used as it was intended to be. So the focus really was on improving the existing services rather than broadening the program. And their technological systems or information systems didn't have the details to show us how they use the funds. So I don't know, Melanie, if I really described that adequately, but it's a shortcoming within their own technology systems. Thank you. My next question is for public safety. So, Mr. Tupper, in the same passage, it says that those responsible from public safety said that the department didn't have an IT system that's modern to properly oversee the details of the problem and ensure that there is follow-up. So, can you tell me how this is done normally within public safety? How do you manage the money that we allocate to you?
Program. I think at the time that particular infusion of funds came in, decisions were made jointly with the provinces and territories to allocate that money against where we thought the highest priorities were. And in that instance, I think decisions were made that were intended to invest in the program to stabilize it and grow it in terms of its current footprint. And so there is only a small opportunity to grow the program. That was a joint decision with the provinces and territories. It goes against what the government had identified in terms of its intent. But it was the simple challenge that we had in terms of the amount of money we had against the kind of investment that we could make. And we chose to stabilize the program as opposed to grow it and keep it thin, perhaps unstable across the board. I won't defend my IT system in the department. The department has, over time, not made the investments it needs to make. Those are oftentimes expensive investments, and we have simply not been able to sustain an IT system that allows us to do the kind of data analytics that we need to do. And this is something that I am looking at now and trying to figure out ways that I can find the cash to make that kind of investment. That's a department-wide challenge that I have.
Merci pour votre réponse.
Thank you for your answer. To the Auditor General, actually, the RCMP are currently, they haven't signed the agreement, so they know what needs to be signed and what the needs are so they can better fill the positions that are open and provide fair and equitable services. So clearly, this is related to our key findings, whether it's in terms of housing or potable water. We really have to ensure that these services are provided. So it's both. My question is both for the RCMP and for public safety. What priority do you give to these issues in your action plans?
I think we can do better between the two organizations in aligning the work that we do and identifying the kinds of resource demands that we have. Again, it is one of the struggles of going through these audits, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I was around in a previous capacity for the last audit. It isn't a black and white situation. The reality for us is we are entering into the domain of provincial jurisdiction. We do not make these decisions on our own. The identification of resources and whatnot are oftentimes determined by the jurisdiction, which in this case is provincial or territorial. And we have to work in all jurisdictions with all of the entities that are involved. We need to do better, and certainly between our portfolio, we have already taken steps, I think, to get ourselves better aligned to make sure that resource allocations are more transparent.
Je vous remercie parce qu'effectivement, l'exercice.
Thank you, because this isn't a simple exercise. When you look at the people around the table, I thank you for your transparency under the circumstances. And obviously, I think that police services are critical and that the role that they play should be valued in our society. I also recognize the importance of Indigenous police services, and I think that it should be recognized as an essential service. But I'd still like to ask the question. There are amounts that are unspent, and at the same time, I have the impression that there are funds lacking in public safety in Canada. So is there sometimes an amount of money that was allocated to Indigenous communities that you've spent elsewhere because it seemed more important to you than the development of these programs?
I would say the program, if we had an application process, would be oversubscribed. I think we have a very clear sense that there is demand out there for the program. So we do not have sufficient funding to cover all of the need in Indigenous communities across the land. There's no question about that. Part of the challenge of the essential service legislation is to try and demark how we evaluate and how we can determine what that demand is. It is a recognition that it is essential, that the policing shouldn't be a grant and contribution program that is fluid over time as governments make decisions about where to put money or not. So the whole point and intent of that legislation would be to establish that platform and create a secure planning cycle. I think the other challenges that we have that the report identifies is the need to do longer planning cycles, to not have automatic renewals, to not wait too long to re-engage with communities, to make sure that we understand the needs that are there. And those are things that we will build in to the program as we move forward, and are part very much driven by the work we're doing with Indigenous communities on the legislation.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to preface my comments today with a very important note for any survivors of sexual assault in Canada who may be watching this or who may be interested in the topics related to the RCMP and their participation or acknowledgement of sexual assault across Canada, particularly of Indigenous women, that this is a content warning for much of my discussion here. And so I do want to be very privy to that and support women and gender diverse folks who are survivors of this. And I will be prefacing my comments and my further questions in relation to the status of sexual assault within the RCMP and by the RCMP. I want to acknowledge as well that there's an immense history in Canada that directly pertains to the RCMP's involvement and direct participation in the project of colonization in North America. I was privy to the Pope coming to Canada to apologize for the Church's role in the horrific residential school system. My family received a note from the then Prime Minister Stephen Harper for the horrendous treatment of children, and the apology by the Government of Canada to the survivors, including my grandmother. One of the worst things that Canada has ever done, and a sin we have to acknowledge continuously, because it hasn't changed, is these systems and how they continue to affect Indigenous people today. The fact that a country like Canada, the British Isles, can send so many to attack so many others, innocent people. The attack and humiliation of men, my ancestors, when the Northwest Mounted Police was created, the toppling of the Red River Métis settlement and the destruction of Batoche was the core mandate of the Northwest Mounted Police. It is the founding mandate of the RCMP today. This founding mandate is carried on continuously. Institutions would continue through the church and through the government to take children after our men were beaten and wounded. They would attack the children. And then finally, they would take women, the life givers, the water bearers of our nation. And today, the RCMP is still conducting participation in the violence against women. Mr. Larkin, you speak about a respect of Indigenous people. Continuously in the news, you don't have to look that far. RCMP are continuously engaged in this violence. Continuously. I'm going to quote from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry in its final report. It was blunt in its assessment. It said, quote, "The RCMP have not proven to Canada that they are even capable of holding themselves accountable." This is a policy failure of a government that is not interested in holding those who perpetrate violence accountable. The RCMP, by Indigenous persons' own claim, can't hold themselves accountable. So who are we to turn to when we pick up the phone and realize the very same perpetrators of sexual violence are the RCMP? You can imagine my tremendous frustration with this. If it was your family, if it was your mothers, if it was your grandmothers, if it was your daughters, imagine the pain. Imagine it for a moment, Mr. Larkin. Imagine that pain of an auntie having to succumb to this kind of violence. I can't speak to this extreme violence as someone who hasn't particularly been involved in this work, but I do know that my colleague Leah Gazan, the Member of Parliament from Winnipeg Centre, has done a tremendous job attempting to hold Canada accountable for the crisis that is the murdered and missing Indigenous women. She spoke to me of a case stemming from Manitoba. You may be familiar with it. It was in relation to RCMP Constable Kevin Theroux, who took an intoxicated Aboriginal woman he arrested out of a cell, drove her to his northern Manitoba home to pursue, quote, "a personal relationship," end quote. According to an RCMP adjudication document obtained by the CBC, fellow officers teased and goaded him by text message to see, quote, "how far he would go," end quote. And another constable observed flirting between Theroux and the woman, saying that he, quote, "jokingly made a comment about having a threesome with her." The senior officer in the detachment said, quote, "it wasn't right," end quote, for Theroux to take the woman out of the custody, but finally said, quote, "you arrested her, you can do whatever the F you want to her," end quote. This isn't just today. Maria Campbell, a remarkable Métis person and survivor of the violence that she had to witness during the clearing of the plains that you participated in, recounted a story in her book, Half-Breed, recounting her time being raped by an RCMP member at the age of 14. He had simply dragged her into a bedroom of her own home, where the RCMP members had come to hassle the family about alleged poaching. RCMP sexual abuse of Indigenous women and girls is an open secret well known by Indigenous communities. This is a tremendous pain in our country today. The reports suggest in our Auditor General's report, and I would say it needs to go much further. It needs to recount, Madam Auditor General, the true history of the project that is the RCMP's core mandate. It must go beyond training. It must focus on accountability. It must focus on individuals being held to true account. Supervisors, commissioners cannot continue to be complacent in this violence. Just recently, just 3 days ago, there was a case where a mounted RCMP officer was charged with child sexual exploitation in St. Paul, Alberta. When is this going to end? When will the RCMP take seriously their history, account for that history, and be accountable to the many lives you've affected and continue to affect today? When?
Thank you very much, Mr. Desjardins. Beginning the start of our next round, Mr. Beerson, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and the Auditor General for her report. We've been seeing a lot of her lately, and I appreciate all the work she does. Over the last few years, we've seen a fairly dramatic increase in online child exploitation, and basically any child with a connection to the internet is at risk. In particular, we've had several boys commit suicide who have been exploited through video game chats. A year ago, I had an opportunity to visit the RCMP's National Child Exploitation Center, and got to see the work that Mr. Larkin does there. I'm just wondering, Mr. Larkin, is your department what's your department seeing when it's coming? Any trends around this, and how does this interface with some of the child exploitation that we see happening around First Nation communities, but also that's happening from Canada to other countries around the world? I recently had the ambassador from the Philippines complimenting Canada on our cooperation with the Philippines, but also frustrated that we don't necessarily have the same presence in the Philippines like some other countries do. We have one RCMP officer stationed in the Philippines, where other countries will have a significant number of police officers because the exploitation happens across the border. It's often Canada. Canada is the number 4 source country for perpetrators coming to the Philippines or exploiting from Canada to the Philippines. So just wondering if we can get a bit of a picture of what's going on with that from your perspective.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. In relation to online child sexual exploitation impacting First Nation communities and anywhere in Canada for that matter, we recognize that those that prey on the most vulnerable do not discriminate. And so our First Nation communities are susceptible, and actually a significant amount of work needs to be done in our First Nation communities across the country, not only from an investigative perspective, from a proactive prevention and education perspective, and there's significant work happening. The National Child Exploitation is celebrating its 20th anniversary, and so it's an opportune time to look at the way we deploy and the work that we're doing, and in partnership with Witness Protection, looking at enhancing and strengthening that program. However, specifically speaking to Philippines, as you're aware and you mentioned, we have deployed one officer, a child exploitation subject matter expert to that country. We just actually had a team from national headquarters from the program area travel to Philippines to meet with Philippine authorities, meet with police officials, government officials, as well as our member there to do a review and an evaluation of the program to see whether or not it requires enhancement. And so as we look at our deployment across, we currently touch 73 countries across the world from a liaison perspective, but obviously recognizing some of the different challenges. And so the program review is not complete in relation to the Philippines to see whether or not we will adjust and/or redeploy or strengthen our commitment there. But that is certainly on the radar as we continue to look at how do we strengthen this. Child exploitation remains a significant challenge and issue in our country that requires significant amount of work to be done.
In terms of human trafficking victims in this country, we know that the stakeholders have told me that around 4% of our population is Indigenous, yet of the victims that they're helping, and these are the ones that we know of, about 50% of the victims that we help are Indigenous. Is there a particular focus from the RCMP on how do we help these victims? How do we bring these cases to resolution? What's your perspective on that?
So thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. The National Child Exploitation Center does have a complete victim identification center. And so those officers are largely focused on identifying victims of the crime and working with tracking and finding and locating those individuals. Clearly, it's an area that needs to be strengthened. Quite frankly, when you look at the underreported crime of child exploitation as well as the volume, it becomes a significant challenge. And so there's much work to be done in that particular piece. But I'm going to ask Assistant Commissioner Warren Brown to talk about several initiatives that are specific to Indigenous communities.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A recent example I could provide is our engagement with some of the national Indigenous organizations, including Inuit communities. Many of the Inuit communities have young adults and children come down to larger hubs, some hubs that we do not police, a different police of jurisdiction, where concern is a high disproportionate rate of human trafficking. Again, as Deputy Larkin had mentioned, it's underreported. The challenge is to identify and build trust, strengthen those relationships to ensure that a higher accuracy of reporting is brought to our attention. From a national lens, we're responsible for policing 13 divisions in Canada. So again, when we police 22% of the population, it's important that we engage and improve partnerships with some of the bigger police organizations. So that's an endeavor before us, but I appreciate your concern, and it's certainly something that we're trying to get a better stance on.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today, and thank you, Auditor General, for this very, very important and timely report. It is important to highlight these issues. I'll start with you, Deputy Minister Tupper, if that's okay, to talk a little bit perhaps about how you manage the relationships between the RCMP and their contract policing with First Nations in the various negotiation agreements that you enter, and then with the federal government in terms of providing resources.
I think the basis of the relationship that we have starts with our discussions at the federal, provincial, territorial level. And so we have a table that we construct with the provinces and territories that kind of lead the way in terms of our overall negotiations for the contract and for all of the other aspects of the interactions that occur across orders of government in this regard. So we have a very well-formulated, a mature table that has a fairly steady cycle in which we engage on these issues. And indeed, I think it's in May, I have my next round where we will engage on these very issues, and the Auditor General's report is a subject that will allow us to kind of confront the need, particularly for better reporting. Part of our struggle is provinces don't report to the federal government. And so we need to find a better collaborative way to pull together the data that is in the hands of provinces and territories, that is certainly in the hands of my department and in the hands of the RCMP. And we need to construct, I think, the proper platforms that allow us to do the proper analytics that have been short over the lifetime of this program.
Thank you. And can you outline for us which provinces you're having difficulty bringing to the table?
I would say we don't have any difficulty bringing provinces to the table. The provinces and territories confront the same challenge that at the federal government level we do. Fiscal frameworks, the realities of kind of priority setting across an agenda at a provincial or territorial level. And so it's a bit cyclical in the sense of some provinces are more active in a given year than others simply by the choices that they make. And that is why we sometimes end up with money being left on the table, because provinces make choices about how they handle the priorities that they expend resources on.
So this meeting that's happening in May, do you have a list of priorities that you will be bringing in terms of building those partnerships?
Well, the number one priority will be to follow up on the recommendations that have been articulated for us, to present our management action plan and to see if we can scope in provincial activities into that action plan to make it more complete. And I think first and foremost, frankly, to build the data sets that we need to simply do better on. We do want to talk to them about the essential service legislation. We want to make sure that we sustain their general approval or agreement in terms of the direction we're heading. They are concerned that we're striking legislation legislation or potentially will be striking legislation, that it is in an area of exclusive provincial domain. And so we need to kind of make sure that as we articulate that legislation, that it is done in a way that applies to the federal government and does not impose on the jurisdiction of the province and territories.
So speaking of provincial jurisdiction, I know the RCMP through contract policing does significant work. In fact, the majority of their resources end up going into contract policing as opposed to federal policing, which is also part of their mandate. How do you support the RCMP and manage their work and how they interact with communities?
So operationally, I don't support them at all because they have a very strict and strong independence in terms of operational matters, in terms of how they conduct their business. A lot of their priorities at a provincial or territorial level are struck by the provincial and territorial government, and that is between them. Where I need to have a relationship with the RCMP on the contract is with respect to how the contract works. The ability when provinces identify need for additional resources, they write to the RCMP and to ourselves and identify kind of those building blocks. So there is a constant interaction of the three parties, but operationally that is left between the province and the RCMP.
Thank you. And Deputy Commissioner Larkin, how do you frame the relationship and with First Nations communities and also with public safety, and how do you measure success? What is your measure of success as you operate in these communities?
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I'll start and then turn it over to Assistant Commissioner Brown to focus on the Indigenous piece because he's the national leader supporting that. But as Deputy Tupper alluded to, each of our provinces and territories where we're the police of jurisdiction and or municipalities have a leadership team. So we engage provincially with our public safety, Solicitor General, community safety colleagues to set priorities around the province. We look at crime severity, we look at patterns and trends and some of the public disorder challenges that are ongoing, and that liaises. We do have a national deputy commissioner that supports a number of the provinces and territories, and we also have a deputy commissioner in British Columbia and Alberta due to the large size of the deployment of RCMP members in those provinces. And so our priorities are set based at the localized level, whether that be provincial, municipal, and then equally that is also turned into the Indigenous communities that we provide policing support towards. And again, there's that national function. And one of the commissioner's priorities was to launch a full-time senior executive, particularly around Indigenous pieces. Around your comments around success, we do have performance measurements, departmental results that we do look at. Those are divvied up across the country based on the area, whether we're the provincial police of jurisdiction, the municipal police service of jurisdiction, and or we also have departmental results at the federal level within federal policing and specialized policing. But specifically to Indigenous, I'll turn to Assistant Commissioner Brown as that falls within his responsibility.
Actually, Mr. Brown, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're just well over our time, but I'm sure we'll come back to you. Encore une fois, c'est Monsieur Lemire. Vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes.
Once again, Mr. Lemire for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Morin, Mr. Tupper, the auditor's report talks about a lack of equity in the funding of this. Some communities should have received more money. Some received less. So can there be some kind of historic catch-up if the communities don't have the ability to open up a service, and so maybe later on there would be a need to invest more? So is there some mechanism in place to allow for that kind of a catch-up?
Madame Morin.
So just with respect to those funding decisions, and I think this is something that the Auditor General spoke to when she mentioned the fact that some of our funding decisions are based on past funding decisions. The nature of the program provides funding to police officers, and that requires us to earmark that money in a year and for all future years, because we know that that police officer will be in place. So in terms of the equity piece, it's important for us to bear in mind that we are looking at cost matching with the province. All of the services that we have, the 36 police services in the self-administered stream, are expected to meet the standards that are in place in the jurisdiction where they are operating. So they are all doing that, some of which are more difficult for them to make it work. As the Deputy Commissioner has mentioned, some of them are operating in very remote areas. We continue to try to stabilize those self-administered police services. We continue to try to drive decisions that will ensure that they have the funds that they need to have stability, predictability, and to strategically plan moving into the future. They are struggling at times to recruit, like all police services, and we want to ensure that what we're doing is being there for them to ensure that they're playing that role that we see they play in the policing ecosystem, in community safety. And that's part of the equity piece as well, is the recognition by other police services as to the role that they're playing and how they are operating interchangeably.
La politique fédérale mentionne que la règle est...
The federal policy said that the rules are pretty rigid.